Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and I've got an absolutely awesome video for you today because in this box, fresh from Intel, thanks guys, I have the brand new 13th gen Raptor Lake CPU, specifically the Core i5 13600K, probably the one that most of you out there will want to be considering given its price is a little easier to palette, and also the Core i9 13900K, the new flagship, the CPU with more cores than Intel has ever released on mainstream desktop or high-end desktop. So don't forget, high-end desktop capped out at 18 cores with the Core i9 10980XE a few years ago, and obviously previous generation, the 12900K and the 12900KS only had 16 cores. So 24 cores this time around, thanks to a big bump in the efficient cores and the specifications we will get onto in a minute. We will be comparing them against, you guessed it, the AMD Ryzen 7000 series to see how these CPUs perform in games and content creation, and also look at power consumption and overclocking as well. So quite a bit to get through today. We're going to be checking out both CPUs and comparing them, so there's going to be lots of discussion, lots of graphs later on, everything timestamped below, so if you just want to flick through to a specific benchmark or the conclusion, you can do that. I also want to thank ASUS for sending over a couple of Z790 motherboards that I'll be looking at very, very soon. I actually used the ROG Maximus Z790 Hero in my testing for the new 13th gen CPUs, and it's an absolutely fantastic board, as is the Rockstrix Z790A Gaming Wi-Fi D4. Obviously DDR4 support with that one as well, which is kind of interesting. But getting back to the task at hand, and yeah, we've got a whole bunch of stuff to get through today. Thanks again to Intel for sending the sample pack over, and also don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to my video as well, or subscribe to my channel, like, comment on my video. Don't forget to turn on those notifications if you do subscribe, because they will notify you as and when I upload new videos, and I've got some absolutely awesome stuff coming out your way, including more CPU reviews, more motherboard reviews. I've got loads of X670 motherboards as well as Z790 stuff turning up. Lots of very, very interesting things coming, so don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. So let's take a look at the specifications. Starting at the top then, we have the Core i9 13900K, gonna get my tongue around that one eventually. And that is the new flagship. As I mentioned, it has 24 cores in total, making it the highest core count processor that Intel has ever released on the desktop. That is comprising 8 performance cores, they're the ones with the real grunt, and also 16 efficient cores. That's 8 more than the 12900K, so we are probably looking at a multi-threaded monster here. Also monstrous is the frequency. The peak boost frequency of 5.8 gigahertz is absolutely phenomenal, and I did see that in testing as well. It usually hit 1 or 2 cores, absolutely huge frequency and a lot faster, hundreds and hundreds of megahertz faster than its predecessor. And I also saw a peak all-core boost of 5.5 gigahertz as well. Again, significantly higher than its predecessor, and some seriously impressive stuff going on there from Intel. As the efficient cores don't have hyperthreading, they only deliver 1 thread each, so you get 16 threads for the efficient cores, and the performance cores are multi-threaded, so that equates to 16 threads. So we have 32 threads in total from this unique 24-core processor. We also have 36 megabytes of L3 cache, and we have a massive 32 megabytes of L2 cache as well. Both of those figures much, much higher than its predecessor. Moving on to the Core i5 13600K then, and we have a boost frequency of up to 5.1 gigahertz. That was met pretty much all the time. In fact, even in multi-threaded workloads, the CPU seemed to get up to that frequency as well. The Core i5 13600K has a slightly different makeup. You have 6 performance cores, but while the 12600K had 4 efficient cores, this one has 8. So it has double the number of efficient cores, and the core count has risen from 10 to 14. So it's got an extra 4 cores and 20 threads in total. 24 megabytes of L3 cache and a massive 20 megabytes of L2 cache as well. So some seriously impressive CPUs here then from Intel, and obviously I'll be looking at the 13700K as well soon. So lots of stuff to get through in this video. Let's crack on. Our first benchmark is the combined Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop Procyon benchmark, and here the AMD Ryzen 7000 series did pretty well. I think this is one of their best results against Intel here. The AMD Ryzen 9 7950X gaining about 1500 points over the Core i9 13900K, which stubbornly refused to get above or much above 11,000. However, it was significantly faster than the Core i9 12900K. Next, we have the Adobe Premiere Pro Puget Systems benchmark, and here the Core i9 13900K had more of an advantage over the Ryzen 9 7950X, but it was failing to beat the Core i9 12900K no matter what I did. I simply couldn't get that benchmark result any higher, and the Intel Core i9 12900K just seemed stuck up there at 1400 points. Now, I know that Adobe has recently released some software update that is meant to improve performance, and that could well improve performance or affect these results in some way. So I don't want to make too many conclusions here, but needless to say, the Core i9 13900K is very, very fast in Adobe Premiere Pro and ultimately faster than the Ryzen 9 7950X. Next up is Cinebench, and in the single-threaded test, well, there's no comparison here really, is there? The Core i9 13900K, by far and away the fastest CPU I've ever tested, and a significant advantage over the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X in this single-threaded result as well, and a significant advantage over its predecessor, the Core i9 12900K. So that massive clock speed, boost frequency of 5.8 GHz, and the new Raptor Lake architecture obviously helping here. A massive win for Intel. Moving on to the multi-threaded score, and again it's a massive scalp here for Intel because the Core i9 13900K has beaten the Ryzen 9 7950X. So it's not by a huge amount, but it's still a significant amount, especially given that the Intel CPU is actually cheaper than the AMD one. So that's a big win there for Intel, and probably even more impressive is the difference between the 13900K and the 12900K. Well over 10,000 points. In fact, it's nearly 13,000 points added by the addition of extra E-cores on the 13900K, as well as the new Raptor Lake architecture and higher boosting frequencies. So really, really great news for Intel in this one. The next benchmark is HandBrake, which is part of the RealBench test suite and simply outputs a score-based result. Again, here the Core i9 13900K just about pipping the Ryzen 9 7950X to the post. But again, it's a win for Intel here because the i9 is actually cheaper. Not by much, but it is cheaper, a little bit more significantly here in the UK. Also a significant boost in this multi-threaded test over the Core i9 12900K, adding nearly 500,000 points onto its score. Forza Horizon 5 is our first game test, and here the Core i9 13900K just about took the top spot, and that was a few frames per second ahead of the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X, which it beat on both the minimum 99th percentile frame rate and also the average frame rate too. So just about a win for Intel here, and we are seeing reasonably good scaling up from the lowest result, which was the Core i5 12600K, which was 10 frames per second slower on the minimum. Also, looking down the stack, we can see that the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X3D is a fair bit slower, obviously not significantly so in this test, but the Core i9 does add around 5% on top of that CPU in terms of performance. Our next game is Watch Dogs Legion, and at 1080p, the Core i9 13900K kind of sitting within the margin of error at the top. There was very, very little between the top sort of 7 or 8 CPUs, so we can't really draw too many conclusions there given that fact. But again, it's sitting right at the top of the stack. The part or the area where everything seems to kind of drop away is around the Core i5 12600K. That's when the frame rate starts to drop significantly below 80 frames per second on the minimum 99th percentile. However, the averages take quite a while to drop down, kind of right the way down the bottom of the graph at the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X3D, which just seemed to lag behind the latest CPUs in that test. The final game test is Far Cry 6, and again, this was just one of those titles that really likes the Ryzen 7 5800X3D. Not in all games, mind you, it's not a clean sweep for that venerable CPU, but here is just definitely one of those titles where it performs really well for the money. Nearly getting up to the Core i9 3900K, but the new Intel CPU definitely takes the performance crown here with a faster minimum and average frame rate. That's the 99th percentile minimum, by the way, and the 7950X, the Ryzen 9, noticeably slower than the Core i9 13900K, both on the minimum 99th percentile and the average frame rate. So it is a win for Intel here, although not by much, over the Ryzen 7 5800X3D. Our final test then is power consumption, and unfortunately for Intel, this is not its strongest point with Raptor Lake. In fact, it's significantly more power hungry and less efficient, even in terms of performance, than the latest AMD CPUs. So, for example, the Ryzen 9 7950X at the bottom of the graph is still pretty power hungry, but 376 watts compared to 546 watts for the system as a whole for the Core i9 13900K. So that's obviously a significant advantage for AMD there. Intel drawing nearly 200 watts more than the 7950X, and that's just something that Intel really needs to work on. But I think the only way it's going to get around that is going to be through shrinking its manufacturing processes, which is on the cards, but obviously AMD having a pretty big advantage at the moment, being on 5 nanometer compared to Intel, which is technically still on 10 nanometer. So again, it's just something that we'll have to live with if you want to go with an Intel CPU at the moment. One could argue that if you are buying a $700 CPU that you're not really going to be concerned that much with power consumption, but it is going to be adding to your electricity bill, especially in these times. You know, we've got horrendous electricity prices here in the UK, and I think there is quite a bit to be said for efficiency just for that, and, you know, global warming and God knows what else. But it's something that Intel really needs to work on. That said, the temperatures weren't too bad. They were actually cooler than the 7950X, sitting in the sort of high 80s under load, full load across all of its cores, whereas the Ryzen 9 7950X is regularly pushing 100 degrees, around 95 degrees. So slightly cooler with Intel. That was with custom liquid cooling though, but then you'd kind of hope to see some sort of a benefit from that. But I would imagine it's just as doable on a high-end liquid cooler or decent air cooler as well. So work to do here for Intel, but it's probably not going to phase the kind of people that are going to be buying this CPU in the first place. Moving on to the Core i5 13600K now then, and this one really surprised me in terms of its performance and overclocking capability, so I thought I'd just spend a couple of minutes discussing that. At stock speed, stock settings, apart from the XMP profile enabled, this CPU is hitting 5.1 gigahertz across all its P cores, which is basically the same as its peak boost frequency, so that's really impressive. What is even more impressive, though, is how far I managed to overclock it. I managed 5.7 gigahertz across all performance cores, which was absolutely fantastic. And that was just with a quick, dirty manual overclock with a V-core of around 1.35, 1.4 volts, I believe. And here, the temperatures, yeah, sure, they're pretty toasty, but this can probably be dialed down to more suitable temperatures, but 5.7 gigahertz, that's pretty significant. So what I've done is I've added the overclock results for this CPU into the graphs, which we will take a look at now. Our first test with the Core i5-13600K then, and at stock speed the score in Adobe Premiere Pro Puget Systems benchmark was 901, with AMD generally performing pretty well here. The Ryzen 7 7700X managing a faster score. However, the Core i5-13600K did noticeably better than the Ryzen 5 7600X. However, for some reason in this test, Intel's previous generation CPUs performed better, and it was the same case with the Core i9-12900K versus the 13900K. The former was faster. It's the same here as well with the Core i5-13600K and the 1200K. The 12600K is faster a little bit. When we overclock the CPU though, it does add a significant amount of performance, rising from a score of 901 to 954. So that's pretty much well worth doing, which almost matches the much more expensive Ryzen 7 7700X, but still lagging way behind the Core i5-12600K in this test, for whatever reason that might be. Moving on to the combined Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop test then, and we have the Core i5-13600K sitting at a score of 9,718, which is roughly a mid-table result, faster than the Core i7-12700K and the Ryzen 9 5950X. A lot faster, 800 points, or 700 points actually, thereabouts, faster than the Core i5-12600K, but AMD has a significant advantage in this test, sitting at the top 4 slots in the graph, which is kind of strange. I'm not entirely sure why that would be the case. It could be something to do with a latency or something like that. Image editing tests usually prefer low latency and of course high frequencies on the Ryzen 7, 9 and 5 CPUs, but obviously pretty high frequencies on Intel CPUs as well. So I'm not sure why AMD has such an advantage in this test, but clearly the Core i5-13600K, not bad, but not great, and losing out to AMD in this test. Overclocking it did add a significant amount more performance, around 700 points or so, but it still wasn't enough to even rein in the Ryzen 5 7600X. The next test is Cinebench, and this is the single-threaded score, and here the Core i5-13600K doing really well, second only to the Ryzen 9 CPUs and the Core i9-13900K. So here it managed to beat the Ryzen 7 7700X, Core i9-12900K, and the AMD Ryzen 5 7600X too. So its stock speed score of 2011 comparing to 1892, so just over 1,000 points added here in the single-threaded score compared to the Core i5-12600K. So overclocking it though, boosting that top frequency up to 5.7 gigahertz, added nearly 200 points, actually more than 200 points should I say, to the score that it achieved at stock speed. So that score rising from 2,000 or thereabouts up to 2,229, just short of the Core i9-13900K. So a great result there from the overclocked Core i5. In the multi-threaded test now, and the extra E-cores that the 13600K has over its predecessor really made their worth known here. So the Core i5-12600K managing around 17,000, that increases to 24,000 for the Core i5-13600K. So big boosts here for Intel in multi-threaded performance, and that was enough to nearly match the Ryzen 9 6950X, which was AMD's previous generation flagship. Also enough to soundly beat the Ryzen 7 7700X. So AMD really struggling in some multi-threaded workloads such as Cinebench, largely thanks to its smaller core count. So that's maybe something that might want to consider for its next generation CPUs, because Intel is starting to run away with things here in multi-threaded tests, and obviously significantly faster, nearly 10,000 points faster in fact than the Ryzen 5 7600X. The next test is HandBrake, and this is a score-based benchmark using the RealBench test suite, which is free to download. And here we have a score just over 1 million points in this benchmark, and that was enough to see off the Ryzen 7 7700X, so not great news there for AMD in HandBrake. Going further down the stack, the Core i5 12600K, again, a lot slower than the 13600K, so there's extra E-cores again showing their worth, and obviously a good 300,000 points or so faster than the Ryzen 5 7600X as well. Once overclocked, we saw a reasonable amount extra performance, but nowhere near what we've seen in other tests. So the performance here only rising by about 40,000 points or so, which was enough to match the Core i9 12900K. Our first game test coming up, and here we have Forza Horizon 5, and this is a game that showed reasonable scaling up from the slowest result, which was ironically the Core i5 13600K's predecessor, the 12600K, which managed a minimum 99th percentile of 84 frames per second, 104 frames per second on the average. The i5 13600K blowing that away, adding nearly 10 frames per second to the minimum 99th percentile and 3 frames per second to the average, sitting at third place in the graph behind itself once it was overclocked, not really adding a great deal, just 1 frames per second added to the minimum 99th percentile, so clearly a bottleneck going on elsewhere in the system. The 13900K just adding 1 frames per second on top of that in terms of the average frame rate, so a fantastic result in this game for the Core i5 13600K. Our next game test was Watch Dogs Legion, and at 1080p, the Core i5 13600K again with a pretty decent result, beating most of the previous generation CPUs in the graphs, including the Core i7 12700K and the Ryzen 9 7900X from this generation as well. But to be honest, the top 8 results or so, as we spoke about earlier with the Ryzen Core i9 even 13900K result, is that the top 7 or 8 CPUs in the graph are kind of sandwiched there at the top with very little variation between them. So I think there's a bottleneck going on around the point where we move past the Core i5 12600K. That seems to be kind of the lower end, dropping a few frames on the minimum 99th percentile. Once overclocked, the result was pretty much the same. So I think, again, that reinforces the view that above that certain limit, there is some sort of other bottleneck going on. The final game test is Far Cry 6, and at 1080p, the Core i5 13600K again performing really, really well. It managed the same minimum 99th percentile as the Ryzen 9 7950X, but offered a much higher average, 141 frames per second versus 133. This was obviously enough to see off the Ryzen 7 7700X and Ryzen 5 7600X, as well as massively outperform the Core i5 12600K in this test too. Another CPU you might want to be comparing it against is the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, which managed a minimum 99th percentile, 1 frames per second faster, and it was still, about 5 frames per second slower than the Core i5 on the average. So not much between those two CPUs. A lot will come down to the Core i7's the Ryzen 7's price and its platform value as well, because that's pretty strong. The Core i5 13600K also pretty strong, with some cheaper motherboards around, as well as its overclocking potential, but a lot will depend on whether you already have a compatible AMD system as well. So once overclocked, the Intel CPU did add a reasonable amount extra performance, gaining 3 frames per second on the minimum 99th percentile and managing 142 frames per second on the average, mostly matching the top scoring Core i9 13900K. The final test then is power consumption, and again, it's not great news for Intel here, because the Core i5 13600K managed a power draw of 331 watts, get the 1 and the 3 the right way round, which is higher than the Core i9 12900K. It's higher than the Ryzen 7 7700X, but it's maybe not as catastrophic as the Core i9 13900K. So that saw the Core i9 obviously reaching up to a massive 546 watts, but 331 watts is only around 60 watts more for the system as a whole than the Ryzen 7 7700X. So as I say, not as catastrophic, but significantly higher than that CPU, and of course than the Core i5 12600K. Again, Intel needs to try and do something about this because it's just one area that it constantly lags behind AMD. And if you look at the Ryzen 5 7600X, obviously not as fast as Intel in a lot of tests here, pretty much all of them. 233 watts versus 331 watts. That's 100 watts less power that it's using. So let's move on to the conclusions. So what do we make of Intel's 13900K and 13600K then? Well, I think Intel has done pretty well here, to be honest. Starting with the flagship 13900K, here in the UK it retails for significantly less than the Ryzen 9 7950X. It also has the benefit of DDR4 support and cheaper motherboards for now, but looking at the raw performance, it really does pack a punch, especially in multi-threaded workloads where it was faster than the 7950X, and it is certainly no slouch in lightly threaded benchmarks either. So in terms of power consumption, there is a clear winner, and it is AMD. The 3900K draws a huge amount of power, and that is definitely something that we would like to see Intel improve upon in future, because it's gone from being relatively efficient in its past, not the recent past mind you, but somewhat distant past, to a manufacturer that's putting out some pretty monstrous processors, both in terms of performance, frequencies, core counts, but unfortunately in power consumption as well. So that is definitely something that we would like to be improved. Are we bothered about that? If you're spending £700, $700 or thereabouts on a processor? Probably not. But the same goes all the way down the stack as well. So fantastic CPU in the 13900K, and probably the one to get if you're just vying for the best desktop CPU out there at the moment. It is probably overall the 13900K, but it is not by any means a clean sweep. Moving down the product stack to the 13600K, this is where things get a bit more interesting, because the power consumption isn't as crazy. It is still more than its AMD equivalents, but with the Ryzen 7000 series generally drawing a bit more power, things are a little more even here. But what isn't even is any kind of matchup between the 13600K and the 7600X, the Ryzen 5. The Core i5 definitely has the measure of that CPU in a big way in some situations, especially multi-threaded performance. That 6-core CPU really struggling to cope with the onslaught of the 14 cores that are underneath the hood of the Core i5 13600K. And as it's an awesome overclocker as well, that meant that it could easily overhaul the Ryzen 7 7700X as well, and even knocked on the doors of CPUs that had more core counts than that and were much more expensive as well. So the 13600K, absolutely awesome overclocker. So that's something that you'll want to bear in mind. You'll obviously want to go with a motherboard that A, supports overclocking, and B, has the VRMs and power delivery and everything else and cooling to deal with that. But obviously being a 13600K, a Core i5, it's not the most power hungry CPU out there. So I think the star of the show here is probably the Core i5, the 13600K, massively improving multi-threaded performance as well as lightly and single-threaded performance compared to the 12600K. A huge upgrade there in a lot of tasks. AMD, again, is still not a clean sweep for the 13600K against AMD. There are one or two situations where AMD is the better bet, but for raw value, as well as the fact that it supports cheaper motherboards and DDR4 as well, I think my money would probably go on a 13600K system rather than a Ryzen 5 7600X or 7700X system. So that's pretty interesting. I know there are lots of people out there that would probably disagree just based on power consumption alone. Obviously, Intel is not doing great there and still has a lot of work to do. But in terms of raw performance across the board, backwards compatibility with Z690 as well, that's something that is going to be probably proving quite popular out there amongst enthusiasts. So Again, thank you to Intel for sending over these samples. Very grateful to be looking at the 3900K and the 13600K again today. Some fantastic CPUs from Intel. Also, thanks to ASUS for sending over the ROG Maximus Z790 Hero, which I did most of my testing on. And thank you guys for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I will catch you soon with more CPU and motherboard reviews. Catch you soon.